Welcome to Between the Bytes, Tech News and Cyber Updates. My name is Gary Arnold, Marketing Director at Executech.
And my name is Derik Parkinson on the marketing team here with Executech as well.
We are joined today by special guest Sandra Smith, the Chief Administrative Officer here at Executech. Sandra, how are you today?
I'm great, Gary. Derik, how are you?
Good.
Doing good. We're excited to have Sandra on here. Let's start off, first of all, tell us about your, I gotta say, slightly, I don't know if unusual is the word, but different title than what you normally hear. So tell us about that and what that means at Executech.
So, being the Chief Administrative Officer is a little bit different than your typical role. A part of it is because I sort of serve in kind of an operations role, but at Executech, operations here is very technical. While I know technology, I'm not a technical person. So, Chief Administrative Officer really is kind of overseeing some of the different kind of back office things that we do here. So really HR, employee development, our internal systems, and of course, is part of the title, the administrative functions of the role. So, making sure that we're compliant in business licenses and all of those types of things. And so that's really what my role encompasses here.
Awesome. And Sandra, you've been here at Executech for over 10 years now.
I have,
which is awesome. And so you've seen all kinds of things, all kinds of growth. You've done all kinds of roles.
I have.
And because of that, we wanted to have you on to talk about all those things because I think a lot of them are relevant to businesses. Obviously, we'll talk about things not just technology related, but I think that's a big part of your role, even being, all of us in the non-technical responsibilities. I guess just a fun question, like what's your favorite part of your job today?
Really, and it's going to sound cliche, and it's because I'm in HR, and that's a really big part of my responsibility, but really people. That's the favorite part of my job here at Executech, getting to know people, getting to rub shoulders with people, and that's just not at a senior leadership level, but really all employees and getting to know them. And that's a passion of mine, is to find people's passion, tap into that. People are working a lot of time, right? Like you're with your work family more sometimes than your own family. And so really making sure that people enjoy their job and we help them find their passion or get them into what they're really passionate about here at Executech.
I love it. And yeah, maybe it's cliche, but it's still true.
It is.
So let's talk just briefly about, and we don't want to hash too hard on this because everyone's talked about it, but the past 18 months, almost 2 years now, have been different, but I guess different is now normal. And as an HR leader and as somebody leading out, and again, on the operations side, there's been a lot of change and adapting that you've had to do. So talk to us a little bit about some of the adaptations you've had to make, why and how you've gone about that over the past, 18 months, 2 years.
Yeah. The obvious one is the remote work, right? So here at Executech, up until, 6 months ago, I also oversaw our finance department. Back in March 2020, if someone asked me, could you run a finance department remotely? I would have been like, probably not. We're just so paper oriented. We're passing things back and forth. Well, the pandemic changed that. And we had to flip that switch pretty quickly. So probably the biggest thing, here at Executech, we were here 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So we had to really adapt, everybody was on a desktop machine. We should probably move people to laptops. How are we going to be able to pass documents back and forth? How are we going to be able to really do the functions that we were doing here at the office remotely? And so really just working with our managers, with our employees, and that's been probably the biggest change for us. And not only that, being in an office, engagement is easy, right? You can lean over to your desk mate or the person in the next cubicle and chat. And we had to find different ways on how to engage employees. We didn't want it to be all work all the time. And so, with my team, we were doing things called Fun Friday. And so every Friday we would do a online game, or we would have different people in the department pick something that we are all going to do. So then it wasn't just all work. You're missing out on the quote unquote water cooler type things, going to the break room. And so for me, it's about, we still do this today. We have a morning huddle and we go over our day just to make sure if anyone needs any help, there's a platform for that, because it's easy to do that in the office. Like, hey, I don't have time to do this. Hey, can you do this? There isn't that unless you intentionally reach out to someone. And some employees have a hard time doing that. So having, those morning huddles and making sure that you get the team together. Same thing, I have an afternoon huddle, and that's just to kind of wrap up the day. And sometimes it's just goofy stuff, but it's that interaction with your teammates. And so for me, it's really top of mind. Another thing in the last 18 months is, how do you onboard a new employee remotely? That's changed, right? We're now here in 2022 at a kind of more of a hybrid point of view, right? So for me, onboarding an employee, we can still do it in the office, but you're not still going to be in the office 5 days a week. So making sure that you dedicate time to that new employee because you want them to feel a part of the company or a part of the team and get to know their manager. And that has to be very intentional now, as opposed to just, hey, you're in the office and we'll run into each other. It has to be a very intentional effort.
I feel like that's going to be a theme of what you're going to share with us today, and what you've shared so far is just intentionality. When it comes to culture, when it comes to anything, people, you got to be intentional about it. You mentioned the example of the accounting department going virtual and never imagining that would be possible, but it's possible, and here we are.
Yep.
Would you say that it's more efficient? It's in a better place than it would have been?
Yes, only because, going back to your comment just a second ago, very intentional, right? You have to be intentional about what you're doing. There are, especially in an accounting or finance role, some of it is very focused, right? And so we've picked up some efficiencies, honestly, because people are working at home. There's not the constant in and out of people coming in and kind of disrupting you. While those things are still important, right? That camaraderie, that interaction with other employees, sometimes it is good to just be at home by yourself, being able to focus, right? So there are some efficiencies. There's positives and negatives, right, to everything. And so if I'm looking at the positive side of, especially in an accounting role, then yes, efficiencies of being very intentional on how you shuffle things back and forth. Also, being able to have a workforce that isn't located here at headquarters, right, or at your office location. For us, we have people in our accounting department that not only sit here in Utah, but in California and also overseas that help us out. And so we were doing some of that anyway pre-pandemic, but it really makes it more on a level playing field for all employees, right? So you're not feeling like, well, I'm sitting here in California and everybody else is in Utah. I think that's a positive of the remote work space we're in now.
Pulling on that thread of pros and cons, you've mentioned some items I think that all relate back to culture.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, would you say the pros outweigh the cons today, 2 years later?
I do, partially because we do employment engagement surveys. Not early in the pandemic, but kind of when we were in the middle of it, we started asking people, as we thought about what does the return to work look like? Do people want to come back 5 days a week? Do they want to be home 5 days a week? Do they want a hybrid? More employees really liked that hybrid sort of thing. One, because they can still interact with their other teammates being in the office, once or twice a week. But then they also have the flexibility of, hey, I have to go pick up my kid at school, or I have to do a doctor's appointment. So I can work starting at 7 instead of 8, take an extra long lunch or whatever. So really giving that flexibility, and managers really having that trust in employees. And if there's something that's not working, being okay to have that conversation. Like, hey, I've noticed things aren't quite getting done, and really making sure that communication is open. So definitely employee satisfaction is higher with more of a hybrid workspace. We're not the only ones seeing that. That's kind of, nationwide, we're seeing that.
As it relates to company culture, what are the big factors that influence company culture, for good or for bad? And again, you've mentioned the theme of intentionality, but what are the tactics? What are the actual action items? Again, for good or for bad, that you've seen here or other companies that can influence culture one way or another?
Having that start from the top, like our CEO literally embodies our company culture. We have 7 or 8 core company values, and he repeats those a lot and gives examples. And we have end of year awards surrounded around our core values. And so I think that's important, is really having the CEO and the leadership team live and breathe those core values.
I think one area that management can struggle, especially with the remote work, is recognition. Even for just the little things in passing, if you're in the office, you can say, hey, good job with this or that. When you're working remote, you don't get those passing moments. So you have to, again, be very intentional about showing that, because from an employee standpoint, it might just be little things, but it goes from hearing consistent good feedback to
Yeah.
almost nothing at all, except for the bigger events, the monthly or quarterly end of year kind of award ceremonies that they may or may not get recognition in. So that's one thing that for managers, it definitely takes a very conscious effort.
Yeah. Being intentional with setting one-on-ones with your employees, giving that space, right, to make sure that feedback, both good and bad, right, like course correction is always important, but to your point, appreciation and gratitude, that goes a long way. Feeling like an employee belongs, that's really important, especially in a remote work environment, right? You're not sitting at the next table or the next cubicle. As a manager, you do have to be very intentional. And while I think lots of managers have gratitude and appreciation, sometimes it's just not in their day to express that. So I totally agree with that.
So this is maybe kind of an odd question, but you've mentioned how you've used meetings, small or other ones, to help foster your team's culture. But what are some other ways that either you've seen or that you would like to maybe try to use technology to facilitate culture building?
So we've done virtual game nights, not just with my team, but with the whole company. We've done bingo. Last year, we did a remote leadership meeting with all of our managers, and we had this kind of virtual Olympics. And that was a good time. I mean, using technology as part of camaraderie is obviously important, especially as COVID is now coming back to be a bigger deal again here in January. And so you're going to get sick of hearing it, but it's really about being intentional, making sure that you're keeping top of mind, like how are we getting people together? In the summer last year, we were able to do some barbecues because it was outside, and I look forward to probably doing that again this spring and summer. But the winter months, winter is always a tough time. Winter, it's after the holidays especially, and February is typically a drear month. And so really being intentional on how are we going to get employees together? How are we going to have fun outside of the normal grind of everybody being busy?
Yeah. Other question related to that, and this one I recognize is super biased, but how does IT specifically impact a company's culture? And it's weird because we're a company of an entire IT department, basically. But if you could look at a client, does IT have an impact on company culture? Or is it more of an operations question?
I mean, really having smooth IT, working where people aren't getting frustrated, that's important. You want to have a good onboarding experience. I talked a little bit about onboarding remotely, and a lot of companies are remotely onboarding because either they're hiring remote workers or you just can't come into the office. So having easy, smooth running technology obviously is important in the onboarding, but also in just communications day to day, right? Like I'm on Teams all day long, but that's because that's an easy and efficient way for us to communicate within the company.
It's kind of a weird question, but I was almost thinking in the back of my head like a Teams-centric company culture versus a Slack-centric company culture. And there might be noticeable differences. I mean, Derik's over there, I can tell.
I can't stand Slack.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I don't know because I don't use Slack, and Charlie would probably be a better person to talk about that because Interlaced use Slack.
Yeah, they're big on it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there are some cool things in Slack that I've read about, right? Like Slack has some donut something thing that really engages people on, it's kind of like a virtual coffee hour or something. I don't know exactly, but Teams doesn't have that. So
My issue with Slack was the noise. There is a lot of ways to be engaged, but it's very easy to loop a bunch of people into conversations that are very random, which in some ways can be a positive because it is a nice, lighthearted area to have a conversation and just kind of talk. But when you want to work, oh my gosh, it just doesn't stop. I struggled with it working in office. I could only imagine what it would be like remote. But with Smooth IT, I would definitely be concerned if I started at any company remotely, not just an IT company, but definitely, especially an IT company. And I'm given, say, a $200 laptop that does not work very well and their connections are bad. And if it's not smooth, it would very much make me concerned about the company as a whole of, am I going to have to just deal with this terrible setup?
It should be easy and intuitive, obviously, right? Because Executech's an exemption, right? Because 70-80% of our employees are technical, but we onboard non-technical people too. And so I don't want to say dummy proof, but you should be able to get a laptop, be able to open it up. Hopefully someone gave you some credentials. You log in and everything just pops up, right? And there's always going to be glitches along the way, but it should be minimal, I think. So really going back to, again, intentionality, like what is that employee experience? Always thinking about what's that employee onboarding experience.
Yep.
I think another takeaway that I'm hearing from all this is that at the end of the day, company culture is people, right? It's defined by people,
Absolutely.
it's lived by people. Technology can enhance that or help it, but it is not. I mean, Teams or Slack at the end of the day, if people like talking to each other, they're going to use whatever means they have, right? And there may be some weird nuances of culture quirks that come up because you're using Slack instead of Teams or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's what you've defined, internally as how we talk to each other that really matters.
That makes me think of a question. Have you ever had any issues, whether it's personally or with any of the other staff, of conversations being held through text form and being misinterpreted?
Absolutely.
I warn everybody, especially when I do training on Google reviews, that you never have a detailed conversation on Google, one for security, but because you lose
Yeah.
all of the nuances behind an in-person conversation when you're in text. Sarcasm is very hard to pick up on. Have you ever dealt with things like that?
Absolutely, right? For me, it's also making sure I know my audience, right? And that's why it's really important to me to get to know our employees, right? So I have one employee that I was dealing with, and this person wrote me this really, really long email. In dealing with them before, I could have replied back to that email, and then I probably would have gotten another email back, going back and forth. But because I knew this employee, I decided, you know what? I will respond back and say, hey, thank you for the feedback. I would love to jump on a call with you so we can discuss this. Because I think you're right. Like going through text, we can each go through our separate points, but it would have taken us so much longer, right? We would have drug it out for a day. Instead of, I got on a 15-minute phone call and had a conversation with this employee, and it was about a policy that we had changed in HR. They were just wondering, like, why did we change it? It wasn't communicated well. And I was able to get on and be like, okay, this is why. He asked a couple questions. I clarified, and that was it. So I think you're right. Like that, while it's easy, and both of you, I've talked about being a keyboard warrior, and it's one of my big pet peeves. Like people can hide behind their keyboard. And it's not about fighting or whatever. It's really about having that conversation. And people may say things through a text or whatever that they would never say to you face to face. And so, yeah, there is some limits to technology. Like you said, I mean, confrontation is super easy, like a lot easier. I'm not saying super easy, but it's a lot easier when you don't have to look at someone in the face and have that hard conversation. Yeah. So there are downsides to that. But again, upside is we can have that conversation even though we're not in the office, because we can do it through Teams or Zoom or whatever and have a video conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. We could talk all day about culture and all these little nuances and things. I do want to kind of bring us back to one last point, and it's kind of a recurring theme of this podcast, and that's security.
Yep.
We've seen, and we're coming up on the season where it becomes even more prevalent, where HR people specifically are targeted for phishing or other cyber attacks, or HR is used as some sort of, form or act or again phishing scam to get to people because HR emailed me and said I need to re-enroll X thing or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. And click this link.
I think the threats are relatively known. We've all heard or seen of the various payroll scams or W-2 scams.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to hear from you, Sandra. We talk to our technical leaders all the time, but what are you doing and what have we started doing and what do you recommend others do to protect against those types of threats?
It's really being vigilant, right? Like we just talked about being easy to send emails back and forth. And so it's easier than picking up a phone or getting on Teams and calling that person. But really about here, our employee development team, they run a phishing campaign on us just to make sure that our employees, right, technical or non-technical, don't fall for it. Making sure that your employees are vigilant. Like if it's something's coming from HR asking for information, it's okay to reach out, whether through Teams or a phone call or, whatever. Like, hey, did HR really send this out? 50% of the time we did. We don't ask for personal information, but sometimes there are things that they're questioning, which I think is a good thing. And that's out to the employees in HR or finance department, especially really having some good policies around. I've heard of someone sending an email to an HR department saying, hey, I need to update my direct deposit. Here's my new direct deposit information. And a payroll person went in and changed their direct deposit information. Didn't know that it was wrong until the employee called and said, I didn't get paid. Well, it should have went to your new bank account. Well, I didn't request a new bank account. Well, I got this email. So because LinkedIn is out there and scammers are looking at LinkedIn, finding out who the payroll person is, finding out who employees are at that company, it's easy to do that. So really making sure, like here at Executech, we don't change payroll, like direct deposit information. We have a self-service. Even if they call in, we say, okay, go through the payroll, our HRIS system. Here's where you go to change your direct deposit. So it really does put the onus on the employee to make sure that's done. So really having policies. Coming from a finance point of view, same thing, right? They send in an invoice. I mean, we've gotten one where it's a totally bogus invoice. And they're just like, hey, this is for cleaning supplies. And so because I'm over the administration here, I got this invoice from our AP department saying, okay, can you let me know if this is approved to pay? And I'm like, that's weird. So I looked up the company it came from, and it's a known scam. And so really making sure that there's checks and balances, especially your frontline AP people, making sure that they're checking in and getting approvals on bills that get paid, because that came through the mail. It didn't even get emailed to us. It came through like a paper invoice. And so really being vigilant. This is a common scam. The CEO sends something, hey, wire this amount of money. I'm in a meeting right now. And for me, I mean, I have the ability to wire money, but myself and the CEO have a password between us. And so if I get that request, even let's say he was actually in a meeting, I either text him or Teams him or call him and say, hey, I got this wire request. What's the password? It's a very unique password. And so we just make sure that there's policies in place to check and balance those, because security is very important, especially in back office roles, right? Because a lot of those people have banking information or the ability to change banking information. And a lot of times it's frontline staff that's doing it. It's not like a higher level manager or leadership role.
Well said. And I think that covers an area that we often don't touch as much on this podcast, and that's just policy processes. We do emphasize a lot of training. And of course, we would be remiss to not mention turning on multi-factor authentication.
For sure. Multi-factor authentication is very, very important. Very important. I'm sure you've talked about that ad nauseum on this podcast.
Yes, we're tempted to rename the podcast.
Yep.
Also, just a small plug to some of our past episodes, because we did talk to Ben Reese, our training manager at Executech, about the phishing simulations, I should say, that we run for our own employees, and the clever tricks, including cute animal pictures that the training team uses to try and get people to fall for it.
Yep. I'm guilty. I fell for that. I wanted to see the cute dog, and she's a dog lover, and why wouldn't we? Yeah. It was very believable, and that's the thing. There's so much out there, right? Social media, that you could find out things on people in a matter of minutes. And so making sure that things are pretty private too in your own personal life, so they can't use that against you in your professional life. I would just caution people on that.
Absolutely. Well, Sandra, we appreciate you coming on today. We had a lot of great insights, great information on all the subjects: culture, company, technology, security. I think we covered a lot of great things. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode, and we will catch you next time.